You probably think you know the story of the greatest rivalry in early rock and roll. But what if it wasn't a rivalry at all? What if it was actually a story of secret gratitude? One of rock's founding fathers, a man who called himself the Architect, went on record to thank God for his biggest competitor. This is the real story of why LittleRichard, in a move that shocked almost everyone, said Elvis Presley was the reason for his own success. In the electrifying dawn of the 1950s, two absolute forces of nature completely blew up the music scene. In one corner, you've got LittleRichard, the self-proclaimed architect of rock and roll. He was a whirlwind of pompadour, pancake makeup, and pure, raw energy. His frantic piano playing and gospel-trained whooping on tracks like Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally weren't just songs, they were a cultural explosion. And in the other corner, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. With a swivel of his hips and a curl of his lip, Elvis became a phenomenon. He was a lightning bolt that took the raw power of R&B and shot it straight into the living rooms of mainstream white America. On the surface, it looked like they were titans clashing for the same crown. The media painted them as natural rivals, the wild, genius originator versus the polished, superstar popularizer. But that whole story, the one we've been hearing for decades, just falls apart when you hear one startling quote from LittleRichard himself. To get why Richard's statement was so stunning, you have to understand the world they were living in. The music charts of the mid-1950s were a battleground. LittleRichard dropped Tutti Frutti in 1955, a song so raw and racy that the original lyrics had to be cleaned up big time for the public. It was a lightning strike of pure energy that flew up the R&B charts. But just a few months later, Elvis Presley released his own version. Now, this was a common and deeply frustrating practice at the time for black artists. White performers would often record cover versions of their songs, backed by major record labels and getting airtime on radio stations that refused to play the original race records. Their versions would often completely overshadow the source material. Elvis's covers of Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally brought those songs to a massive white audience that LittleRichard just couldn't reach at first. So the narrative was simple. Elvis was cashing in on Richard's music. They were two kings fighting for a single throne. Richard was the true innovator, the authentic source of this new sound. Elvis was the handsome, marketable face who made it safe for the masses. From the outside, it looked like a classic story of appropriation and injustice. And honestly, that story makes perfect sense. It's what you'd expect to hear. Which is why no one was ready for what LittleRichard said when he looked back on it all. Years later, long after both men were cemented as legends, someone asked LittleRichard about Elvis. You'd expect him to be bitter, right? Maybe a little resentful, or at least have some complicated feelings about it all. Instead, he dropped a line that flipped the entire story on its head. Looking back on that whole era, he said, "I thank God for Elvis Presley. I thank the Lord for sending Elvis to open that door so I could walk down the road, you understand?"
Elvis Presley.
I love him. That's my buddy, my baby. I love him. We are very good friends, and it was a very great loss to the music world. Elvis is one of the greatest performers ever lived in this world, and electrifying, elevated, he's just, you can't say enough.
And that wasn't a one-time slip. He said it again and again. He explained that Elvis made it possible for him to get seen and accepted. The architect was thanking the man everyone thought had stolen his blueprints. It was so counterintuitive, it felt like a puzzle. Why would a pioneer thank the person who covered his songs? Why would a black artist who fought against a segregated industry praise the white artist who seemed to cruise right past him? To get the answer, you have to look past the stage lights and into the harsh reality of 1950s America. LittleRichard's gratitude didn't come from being naive. It came from a sharp, practical understanding of the world he was up against. In the 1950s, America was deeply segregated, and that included the radio waves. There were white stations and so-called race music stations, An artist like LittleRichard could own the R&B charts, but couldn't get his original songs played on the mainstream pop stations that reached the massive white teenage audience. And that's where Elvis came in. Elvis was the perfect cultural crowbar to pry that door open. He was a white guy from Mississippi who genuinely loved and was shaped by black music, gospel, blues, and R&B. When Elvis sang Tutti Frutti, he was acting like a Trojan horse. His version, blasted on national TV and pop radio from coast to coast, introduced the very DNA of LittleRichard's music to an audience that might never have heard the original. LittleRichard saw this perfectly. He knew Elvis wasn't just making a song popular, he was making a sound popular. He was kicking down the doors of musical segregation. Once Elvis made that wild sound desirable to mainstream white kids, the door was wedged open. Suddenly, radio programmers and record execs, scrambling to meet the demand Elvis had unleashed, started looking for more of this new sound. And who was right there? The undisputed, high-energy source? LittleRichard. Elvis's success created a rock and roll tidal wave that, in the end, lifted everyone up, including the very artists who inspired him. The newfound interest in rock meant LittleRichard's own records started selling more, his concerts got bigger, and his fame exploded globally. He recognized that Elvis was the catalyst for a cultural shift that ultimately benefited him in a huge way. This wasn't just about money either, it was about respect. Behind the scenes, the two had a relationship built on mutual admiration. Elvis never claimed he invented rock and roll. He was always quick to praise the black pioneers who influenced him. After Richard's passing, footage of old interviews showed Richard speaking fondly of Elvis, saying, "I love him. That's my buddy, my baby. I love him. We are very good friends."
Elvis Presley.
I love him. That's my buddy, my baby. I love him. We are very good friends, and it was a very great loss to the music world. Elvis is one of the greatest performers ever lived in this world, and electrifying, elevated. Oh, just you can't say enough.
Richard saw Elvis not as a thief, but as an ally, intentional or not. He saw a fellow musician who, because of his skin color, could carry the torch into places Richard was initially blocked from, lighting the way for him to follow. So what's the big takeaway here? This story completely messes with our easy narratives of heroes and villains, of innovators and imitators. The relationship between LittleRichard and Elvis Presley wasn't a simple case of cultural theft. It was a complicated, symbiotic relationship that existed inside a deeply unfair and segregated system. LittleRichard's statement isn't him excusing that system. It's proof of his brilliant understanding of how to work within it. He was a master strategist, not just a master musician. He knew that in the fight for cultural recognition, sometimes the most powerful move is to recognize an unlikely ally. This story forces us to see history in shades of gray. Yes, Elvis Presley benefited from a system that gave white artists an unfair advantage. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that he used his platform to help tear down musical walls. LittleRichard wasn't a victim in this story. He was a clear-eyed revolutionary who understood the power of a Trojan horse. He knew Elvis was cracking a door open, and he was ready to kick it down and charge right through. The story of LittleRichard thanking God for Elvis isn't about submission. It's about profound insight. It shows that behind the public rivalry was a shared respect, and it proves that the history of music isn't a straight line, but a tangled, fascinating, and often surprising web of influence, ambition, and unexpected gratitude. This hidden history is a powerful reminder that the real stories are always way more complicated than the simple headlines. So many of these incredible music histories get lost over time. If you love digging into the truth behind the legends, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive.